Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.
The interview series Reflections in Time was begun by the late Professor Paul Borghi more than 20 years ago. This new series continues Paul's work and is dedicated to his memory. This is how Paul began many of the 73 interviews that he recorded. It's often exciting to look at the future of UNO, what it might be like in times to come. Sometimes, though, it's important to stop. Stop and take a look at the past of the university, the people and the happenings that helped make the excitement of future history possible. With this in mind, join me for Reflections in Time. My name is Jack Newton. I'm retired now, but I'm still active as a professor emeritus. I've been on the faculty of UN Omaha since 1960. And I served for 20 years as Dean of the College of Arts and Sciences. I worked closely with Professor Borghi in the development of his original interview series, and I can think of no more fitting tribute to him than to continue this work. It's a bright and chilly November day here in Omaha. It's a very cool day, as I said, but it's warm here in the studios of KYNE where we are recording this series. And I have as my guest today Robert S. Runyon, who was a long-time director of the library at UNO, and I think his last title was Dean of Library Services when he retired just a short while ago. But Bob, you had welcome here to the program.
Thank you, Jack. It's great to be here.
You had 22 years, I think, nearly a quarter of a century here as in the UNO library. And I remember when you first came here because I was part of the group that helped bring you here.
That's right. You were chairman of the search committee.
Right. Well, it's a real pleasure to have you here in the studio this afternoon. You know, we've talked a lot over the years, but I don't remember us talking a great deal about your roots. Want to tell us where you came from? Tell us a little bit about your background.
Well, I was born in New Jersey, Summit, New Jersey.
Well, it's nice to have you admit to that.
Not many well-known New Jerseyans in Nebraska. Actually, my parents could never really find Nebraska on the map, but went to school there and went to college later on in Connecticut at Wesleyan University, and then worked my way kind of west through a series of moves.
When did you graduate from Wesleyan?
1956.
Okay. And then what was your major when you were there?
Philosophy with a minor in psychology.
Oh, that's interesting. How did you, but you switched over eventually to library science. How did that happen?
That's right. Yeah, actually, I went to Wesleyan with the idea of becoming an engineer. My stepfather was an engineer, and I thought it'd be good to get a liberal arts education in a small school like that, and then transfer to an engineering school and get an engineering degree. And Wesleyan had a program like that. And then I found that I wasn't all that good in calculus and math, and I got to be more interested in philosophy, and although that seemed to be like a subject without a career to follow, that's where I gravitated with no particular career direction at that point.
Well, your interest in humanities, if I remember correctly from the resume you gave me, led you to an interesting year after Wesleyan, didn't it?
That's true.
You went abroad.
That's true. I had a friend who got very excited about a French language course at Wesleyan. It was a conversational course that met every day of the week, every weekday, at 8 o'clock in the morning. And after the first class, there was nothing spoken in the class beside French. And I had deferred my foreign language requirement because I didn't know what I wanted to take. I took Latin in high school, and Miss Webb, who was the teacher at Summit High School, said, Bob Runyon, unless you pay attention to your Latin, you'll never go to college. And I did okay in Latin, but I never thought I had any interest in languages until I had this friend who that I mentioned, and so I started taking French courses. And so I really had kind of a minor in French too, and decided to take a summer in France after my junior year, and then I got a scholarship after my senior year to go to Paris to study at the Sorbonne, and I did that, and it was a marvelous experience for me. Yes.
Anything specially memorable about that?
Well, it was at the school. I always loved to say the name of the school. It was a sub-school of the Sorbonne. It was called l'École de perfectionnement des professeurs de français à l'étranger. And I mean, that just kind of is neat to rattle that off. And I think about that experience, one thing that's always stuck with me was the learning that we did of French literature and the exposure that we got to what is a very analytic method of approaching literature that they call exposition de texte, where effectively you take an author's work and you analyze it paragraph by paragraph and line by line, and finally you find a paragraph, often in his first published work, which has got all the themes and the structures that you later see developed in many other novels and whatever poetry, whatever else he wrote. And so, he or she wrote. And so, we did exposition de texte, and we learned that as a technique for looking at language and particularly at literature. And I think that was an eye-opener for me, and something that formed my interest in writing and also in the way I like to read. And
did you live in a garret on the West Bank like students are supposed to? Or?
Kind of. Actually, I was supposed to live in something called the Pavillon des États-Unis, which was at the Cité Universitaire, which was a big suburban campus where all of the American scholarship students were supposed to go and to live. And I was to have an American roommate, and when I found this, I said, I didn't come here to do that. I came here to learn the language, and I said, I would like to have my subsidy for the dormitory that I would live in there, and then I will go out and find an apartment in Paris, in this case on the left bank. And that's what I did. I found a small apartment that was being sublet, and there was another student or two there. And so I lived right on the Rue Jacob, and we've gone back and visited that place and looked for that apartment several times in subsequent years.
It's still there?
Well, Rue Jacob is still there, but it's very much changed from what it was then, and I couldn't quite remember the address, but right across the street there was something called the Café aux Assassins, and that was there when we visited about 6 years ago, but it's gone now.
Well, it sounds like a wonderful experience. I take it that you'd recommend that sort of thing to any student.
I think so. I think it's good to learn another culture. It's good to see America from the vantage point, in this case of France.
How did, can you think of how that experience that you had there has changed you in later years? Has it had any effect, for example, on your on other work that you've done or jobs that you've held or anything of that sort?
Not directly. I can't think of any direct effects. I've continued to try to maintain an interest and a contact with things French through the Alliance Française in other cities that we've lived in. I never went back until about the early 90s, but I think it's maybe some appreciation for language, literature, and the arts that that is certainly part of the French culture. That doubtless has had a lot of influence on me.
From Wesleyan then, and then to Sorbonne, where did you go from there? What did you do next?
Well, I came back to New Jersey and checked in with some high school buddies and found out that our names were in a sequence to be called up for the draft. It was then about 1959, and so I enlisted rather than be drafted. I enlisted in the National Guard.
Mm-hmm.
And served in what was then called the Reserve Forces Act program, the RFA 5.5-year program. And so I spent several years, not the full 5.5 as it turned out, but several years in the National Guard and then in the Army Reserve, and had that exposure to that side of things.
And then?
My first job was actually as a following that, I think, was at the New York Public Library. And I got a job at 42nd and 5th Avenue at the main reference division of the New York Public Library. And it was also, at some point, I'm not sure I've got the sequence right, I decided to go to graduate school at Rutgers, as they say, the state university, and I got a graduate degree in library service there, and I think that was 1961. Mm-hmm. And then while I was doing that graduate work, I was also working at the New York Public Library. And it was at that time that I became aware of a trend in library service that was looking at the application of data, what was then called electronic data processing, punch cards, to the handling of library procedures and processes. And I thought, hey, this is really exciting. And I would see, as I was cataloging these books in the library, that the whole bunch of them were coming. There were treatises and studies coming, particularly then from Western Reserve, that explained studies that were the use of data processing in libraries. And I got very excited about that. It kind of hit part of my engineering interest that I had acquired from my stepfather, and I thought, hey, this is an aspect of libraries that I think I'm interested in, and so that was a kind of a discovery point for me in a way.
Well, what maybe I asked this before, but what got you into that library science program at Rutgers? How did you happen to get interested in pursuing that degree?
It was kind of fortuitous. I had a friend, a classmate from Wesleyan, who was then at the Woodrow Wilson School at Princeton. Mm-hmm. And I thought, I think I was living in Summit, and Princeton was 45 miles away, perhaps. And I thought, I'll just go down and visit Barry Passett. Mm-hmm. And I know he's down there, and we'll talk. And he said, well, what are your plans? And I said, well, I haven't got any firm plans. I'm not really sure, about things. And he says, well, what have you done? And I said, well, I've spent a lot of time in libraries. I worked at the Neolin Library at Wesleyan. And he says, well, what is it about libraries that you like? And I said, well, it's like, it's a whole world there, and you can pick and choose, and there's all this information, and you can figure out how to use it and apply it for yourself, and that just seems fascinating to me. I'm interested in so many things that and so I like libraries. And he says, well, have you ever thought of becoming a librarian? I said, no, not really. And he said, well, do you want to think about that? I said, well, perhaps I would. I think it was on the way back from Princeton that I decided to just I knew that Rutgers had a library school. And so I think I just decided to stop in and visit. And I met the then dean of the library school, who was Ralph Shaw, who was a particularly impressive individual. He's one of the pioneers of library science, library service. And I had a marvelous interview with him, and he encouraged me to apply and to get in the program there. And he had an enormous influence on me. He again had a kind of an engineering interest about libraries, and particularly from the technical side. And he had been the librarian of the Department of Agriculture, and he'd just done an enormous number of things. And so I think it was that sequence of having lunch with a school friend, and then going back and talking to the people at Rutgers, and then I thought, well, I think I'll try this.
What, just out of curiosity, what do you learn in library school? What sorts of coursework do you take?
Well, then it was somewhat different than it is now. There are typically courses in cataloging, and it's kind of the marking and parking of books. There are courses in reference and public service and how you interpret and make collections available to other people. There were beginning to be some very early courses in the use of data processing. And there were courses oriented towards the different types of libraries, public libraries, academic, special, children's. There were courses in what was called Kitty Lit, children's literature. And I always used to be very disdainful of those. I just thought, no way do I want to learn or spend any time with Kitty Lit. It's ironic that over the past several years, I've become very interested in Kitty Lit, and I think it's some of the greatest literature that's out there. I have a lot of fun with it. That's one reason why I wear a Dr. Seuss tie.
I guess for the benefit of our audience who might not be able to see it, that necktie you're wearing has a picture of Dr. Seuss or Cat in the Hat.
The Cat in the Hat.
On the bottom
yes.
of it, doesn't it?
Yes, indeed.
And with library books on the top.
And I got that from the American Library Association, and I'm always glad to wear it, and it's a lot of fun with me, for me, yeah. So what the courses that were taught then have now there's an awful lot in library school education about the use of computers and the internet, more on teaching, because librarians, particularly in an academic setting, are doing more teaching. And so it's really, and so the cataloging, which is now typically done centrally by the Library of Congress and other collaborating libraries and available electronically all over the world, the cataloging, which Ralph Shaw used to say in my student days was the real intellectual core of librarianship, that's really done by very few specialists, and in most libraries you purchase or acquire the cataloging done elsewhere because it can be done in those standardized ways. But there's some, and also administration is taught more in library schools now than, although there were then too courses in library administration. Okay, so you went to Rutgers, the State University? The State University. That all goes together. You got your Master of Library Science degree? That's right. You must have been ready then for your first job. You bet. First library job. Yes. And that actually, if I recall correctly, after New York Public was East Orange Public Library, and in New Jersey, and I worked in that setting for some period of time, and then I think it was after that I left to go to Mack Trucks as a special librarian, and I was in charge of their research library there. And actually I was charged to set it up for the company that was then based in Plainfield, but it had operations in Allentown, Pennsylvania, and then laterally in Hagerstown, Maryland. And so I set up this research library basically for a truck manufacturing company, and I worked with engineers in that setting, which I found a lot of fun. There was a project that really I just took by the teeth, and maybe it's kind of a diversion, but it was something that was then called pitting of diesel engine cylinder liners, and it was where the cylinder liners in diesel engines would would pit through and they would fail. And I did an extensive literature search on that and helped us find, for the engine design division, some remedies for that particular condition.
Is there a big difference in working in a specialized research library and industry and working in a university library, as you have been for the past many years?
Very much. And matter of fact, it was looking at those differences that caused me, when I was in another special library, the American Institutes for Research in Pittsburgh, where I worked for several years. It caused me to think, gee whiz, this is basically a one-man library with few assistants. We're running an overhead budget. We've got very limited resources. When there are cutbacks, the library suffers. I would like to be in a larger organization where we've got a clearer purpose and a stronger reason for being, where we're insulated from some of those factors, and we're particularly where we can use computers, because computers were then coming to be more and more of interest, particularly large mainframe computers.
So American Institutes for Research is a pretty large organization, isn't it?
It is. It was. And we had branches in Menlo Park and Palo Alto and Washington, and it was a behavioral research outfit, and so we had a pretty good library there. But there again, like I say, it was just a situation where I found it constraining, and I thought that also I was getting married just around that time, and I felt that I needed to make some more money, and I thought, well, I need to plot my career in a direction that will take me beyond the limitations of the special library setting. And so for that for me was academic libraries, because I then started applying for academic libraries.
Well, while you were at AIR in Pittsburgh, if I remember correctly, you started taking some coursework at the University of Pittsburgh.
I did, you bet. They had a library school there. I had my library degree, but they had an emphasis on what was then called documentation, which was a kind of, again, a data processing emphasis in libraries. And I took courses there in statistics and library service and a bunch of things. I've been kind of a perpetual graduate student in each of the institutions and locations where I've worked, yeah.
So when you decided that university environment would be something you might aspire to, where'd you go from there?
I went from the American Institutes for Research in Pittsburgh to Johns Hopkins, or the Johns Hopkins University, they call it. I went there as a systems analyst. I was hired by the director to come in and fix a broken circulation system. It had been designed by the Operations Research Department with NSF funding.
Tell me what a circulation department is.
A circulation system
is.
The book checkout and fine tracking and
so it has nothing to do with air conditioning or anything
exactly,
like that.
Yeah, not the HVAC, right. Yeah, exactly. But they had this experimental system that was designed on a research contract, and it was very innovative. It was way in front of anything that that was going on. It was where there started to be a lot of operations research interest and inventory control in what you do with libraries, and that's what was happening at Johns Hopkins and in Purdue and elsewhere. And so I was hired to make the system work because it had problems with it, and so I worked on that for several years, and then when the job as the head of technical services, which is that part that's involved in the organization of materials within a library, when that position became vacant, although I hadn't then aspired to any real administrative kind of career or direction, I just thought, well, they're liable to get somebody in there that I wouldn't care to work with all that much. Maybe I'll just apply myself, which I did. And so I became the kind of in a middle management position there at Johns Hopkins, and had a lot of opportunity to work in a larger administrative setting, as well as kind of do some more with computers in libraries.
And then you moved on from there.
Then from Johns Hopkins, we went to the University of Utah. My wife and I had visited Salt Lake City on a trip to the West Coast, and so we'd had some exposure to that part of the country, and when a job became available there as the associate director of the library, and in that setting I would be in charge of not only the technical but the public services operations, we chose to apply for that, and we filled up a Ryder truck and hooked on the old station wagon to the back of it and drove from Baltimore to Salt Lake City.
Oh, was that a big change for a dyed-in-the-wool Easterner?
It sure
went to
was.
Wesleyan and was working at Johns Hopkins. Now to go all the way out to Utah, that's a little different, isn't it?
It was different in many ways. Most people who come into Utah from the outside, they may either be Mormon or they may be skiers. We didn't happen to be either. But I had read up on the Mormons through Wally Stegner's Gathering of Zion and that kind of thing, and I had great respect for what had been done out there, and I had this new, larger, wider responsibility, but it certainly was a different environment.
Geographically as well. I mean, beautiful country, but completely different than the East Coast.
I mean, in Baltimore, everything was humid all the time. I never used to water any of the plants. When we got out there, we bought a house. I discovered that unless you water things, they all dry up and blow away. And so, you know, I studied how to run the sprinkler system.
Well, what did you do now as associate director at University of Utah?
I was in charge of 5 departments that included technical services and public services and media and related and special collections, and so I had an opportunity really to work with the total organization. And it was an exciting place to be. It's a great university. It's a great setting. There was a marvelous organization in place called the Utah Library Council, where libraries from all the libraries got together and collaborated on various kinds of projects: academic libraries, public libraries, community libraries, and I really kind of glommed onto that because I've always had this interest in kind of going beyond the narrow framework of one organization and working through and with many organizations, and so we did a lot of very fresh and innovative things that weren't being done elsewhere in the country.
Can you think of one in particular?
Well, particularly with database searching, the provision of databases through remote terminals. Most libraries weren't doing that, but through our University Library Council, we actually formed a program that both provided us with a then very primitive teletype hardware and training for...
That really was on the cutting edge. I remember the first time I ever heard the word database was back in 1975, and this must have been right about that time.
That's right, exactly. That's when it was. No, it was a very good experience that way, and it was a growth experience in administration, as well as starting to work with professional organizations. I became active in the Utah Library Association, Mountain Plains Library Association. Got elected to the Council of the American Library Association. So I started, you know, really expanding out from the primary job and kind of getting interested in the broad professional field and working with other people around the country and going to conferences and publishing papers. And
now, you mentioned a few minutes ago being a perpetual graduate student. Did you do some graduate work at Utah too?
I did. I began to think about either an MBA or a doctorate. I was thinking more of a doctorate, and I started taking courses in actually a number of them were performance measurement, psychology, education. I didn't quite have a handle on what I wanted to do. I thought, well, perhaps a doctorate in educational administration, something like that. And so I took a whole bunch of courses there that were kind of leading in that direction.
Well, I think we're finally about to get you to UNO here.
Get to Omaha.
Right,
yeah,
after about 30 minutes of discussion.
Really?
So, what made you consider applying for a job at UNO?
Well, it was kind of like coming backwards on the Mormon Trail. I told you that my wife and I had gone through Salt Lake City. On the same trip, we'd gone through Omaha, very fast and brief, and during a tornado, actually. But when the job as director was listed here in 1978, I thought, well, I've been an associate director, and the next thing would be good to be a director. And I'd heard a little bit about the university, and the fact that it was affiliated with a statewide system, notably the University of Nebraska, I knew that even though I would be working in a smaller library than the one that I came from, I would have an opportunity to work closely with the larger library, in this case UNL. And so I'd also learned that there were opportunities here for developing the computer support side of things, and that I'd have the opportunity also to build a kind of a basis where the librarians would have faculty status or privileges, as I had known at Utah. And I'd have the opportunity to hire a lot of the middle managers that we would need. And so I thought it was a great opportunity, and came in November 1978.
What was your first impression of UNO when you showed up on campus for a job interview back in 1978?
Well, at that point, the library was on the kind of the western frontier of the campus. There was just mainly residential.
So we had moved out of what's now the administration building.
That's
the
true.
library. We had a brand new library.
You betcha, because the building was new in 1976, and so it was definitely an asset, and of course there were lots of growth plans and growth things in process. But the library needed leadership, and I was welcomed here with open arms, and it was the beginning of a very, very profitable and productive relationship for me.
Now, if I remember correctly, that brand new building that you were looking at when you first came here is some people have said that it's a little unusual for a library building. It's got a lot of open spaces that some libraries don't have, and so on. Can you say anything about the building as a place to work and as a place to serve students?
The openness is a certain advantage, I think, in that you can move things around. There are various technical pros and cons about the building. It was I enjoyed the story that Kermit Hansen told, that when he was on the board.
Kermit Hansen was a longtime member of the Board of Regents, and who was recently, well, not a few years ago, deceased.
You bet.
Yeah.
He was one of the ones who pushed for that building to be built, and was one of the most effective in seeing that happened. And when he learned that when Stan Howe, who was the architect, had come up with a design that was below budget, he said, well, let's expand it 2 more banks out. I think it was 5 banks, and then he said, let's add another 2. Let's just make it a bigger building. And they went ahead and did that. It was a marvelous thing that they did, because we've certainly used that space to advantage, and I don't know where we'd be without that extra space. But he just had the foresight and the quickness to bring that up, and so it was a very economical design, and that part of the reason why they were able to save that money and come in under budget was that we talked about HVAC, they included the heating, ventilating, and air conditioning into the columns and the lintels. And so instead of putting extra ductwork in the ceiling and the floors, it was into the concrete substructure and the superstructure as well. And so that was a very cost-saving maneuver. It had some disadvantages with regards to adjustment and balance and other things with area handling within the building, but you have those trade-offs. The thing that I've spent a lot of time on since is trying to expand that building and try to get new money to
and sometime or other, libraries do fill up, don't they?
They do fill up. They do fill up.
Especially with the information explosion.
Exactly. Exactly. I had there was a man named Fremont Ryder who was one of the library pioneer who said back in the 40s that research libraries are expanding, doubling every 16 years. And there's no way that we can keep up with that in terms of capital expenditure of expanding buildings that much. And when microforms became available, that would solve the problem, because libraries would then convert to microform, and then you would get away from this avaricious expansion of space. And that was supposed to be then the answer to not needing to build larger libraries anymore. As it turned out, microfilms just became one form of the various kinds of information packages that libraries deal with. Not everything is available on microform or would be practically usable and accessible on microform. And we've had subsequently other revolutions where, well, now it'll be on disk, or it'll be on the internet.
Everything's digitized.
Everything's digitized, and therefore we won't need libraries anymore. My answer to that is a library is not a warehouse. A library is a social organism. It's where people come to learn, to work together and to do things. And the attendance, I was interested in reading the annual report for this year. The attendance in the UNO libraries continued to increase to, I think last year it was 501,000 people came into the building. And I think it was something in the order of over a 10% increase. So people are still coming to libraries. They're still coming to the buildings where libraries are situated, but they all have all these other tools, obviously, that you can surf from your home and navigate. And of course, the UNO library is open, what we say, 365. I mean, you can get on the web and get access and find out a whole lot of things, do a whole lot of library work from your home computer.
And I suppose part of the situation, too, is that you've got people in libraries. I mean, people working there who can give you assistance and advice. And
yes. Yes.
So you've got a reference desk where you can go and ask questions.
Right.
In fact, every now and then you've been known to get your hands dirty in those jobs, haven't you?
Well, that's something I think an administrator should do. And it's very important to know what your staff is involved with, the interaction and the go and back and forth that they have with users. It's very important to know what is working and what's not, and that you be accessible to staff and to patrons. And it's a lot of fun. It's a lot of fun. It's in some ways it's more fun than administrative work too. So I enjoyed all the times that, and it wasn't much, but the times that I served on the reference desk.
Well, if we have some people who are watching this tape who may be students or may use libraries, have you got any advice you could give them as to how best to use a library, how to get the most out of it?
Well, one thing I think that is not always apparent is get to know a librarian. I think people are often reluctant to ask a question, or they may not think that a response will be forthcoming or util or responsive. The librarians, I mean, librarians don't enjoy hiding books. They get their jollies from making that information available. And there's nothing that's more exciting or more fun in a library environment than connecting with a user's need, identifying what the want is. They express a need, and there's some underlying want that you may take more negotiation and discussion to figure out, and then finding out what that want is, and then guiding them and coaching them to where they can, how they can get to that, and also in the process, perhaps giving them information for the next time it comes up. They'll know how to do it themselves. And beyond that, I think it's the teaching function that increasingly a lot of us consider most important in academic libraries, whereby the librarians actually become teachers and offer courses, as the UNO library is now doing, in information literacy, and working closely with faculty to develop a course, in this case a one-credit course, that introduces people to the whole universe of information, both print and non-print, electronic, recorded information, media, and that, I think, is a very exciting thing, and it's a very suitable addition to the academic program, because every course, as it pursues in depth within a certain discipline, as you know, the information requirements are increasing. Sure. And so when the library becomes a proactive teacher and a provider of the skills as well as the tools and the artifacts themselves, that makes a whole lot of sense. The librarians spend a whole lot of time learning about this stuff, and when you put them in a classroom and actually have them working with students, then some good new things happen, both for the students and for the library and for the faculty.
Now, when you first came here many years ago now, the library was quite different than it is now, in that didn't have the technological features that it has now. Does that increase or decrease the number of people that you need to operate a place like that?
We have been very fortunate at the UNO library that even through budget decreases that have caused staff declines, I think the library staff has been able to provide as good or better services and collections access than before. I think it has been, while it's not clear in every case that computers increase productivity. I mean, they certainly have with our economy. I mean, there's certainly a broad factor there. But for the long time, I think it's only fairly recent that people have actually looked and found productivity increases through the use of computer technology. But we have spent and put an enormous investment, both of staff and equipment and funding, to use the new technology, and it's enabled us to run the place with fewer people.
What was the size of the staff when you first came here versus today?
I've got the number somewhere, but I think we're somewhere in the order of I think we had somewhere in the mid-70s, and we're now down in the high 50s or 60s. So it's not a dramatic increase, and some of this difference is caused by there's a fair amount of reorganization of positions and tasks. And so
that was going to be my next question.
Exactly,
what's the difference in the positions that you have in those?
Well, for instance, now we've got a systems analyst person in the library, a systems librarian position. We've got other technical people working at a very high level as regards technical and networking capability. We didn't have those people. I mean, those have been acquisitions over the past 6 or 8 years through budget reallocations and the filling of vacancies and the redesign of positions to redefine the role and the operation of the library as one that's based on on systems and networking as a part of its core operation.
Does this require a lot of retraining?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
The training never stops. We've always done staff development, and staff development is a high priority in all of this, and often because the library has not been able to afford. I say we, and I retired in June. The library has not been able to afford the level of professional and technical skills, and so one of the things that has been done there, I think very effectively, is to what I call grow your own. To take people with talent and give them opportunities, training opportunities, workshops, send them to conferences, and to have them to develop the skills that are needed to apply the technology. And without that approach, there's no way that we would have been able to develop some of these marvelous web-based and other database services, the online catalog and the rest of it. The online catalog, when that was purchased in 1979 and began operations in 1980, there was no technical person on the library staff at all. And we began with a consultant from the computer, one of the computer labs, a graduate student, a young student who had not even yet completed his undergraduate degree. And he began the initial technical work that allowed us to bring in this system. It was a turnkey system, which makes it easier for installation. That means you're not writing, all the software yourself. You couldn't do that anyway. But so that's the approach of grow your own that we've taken with staff who have very important responsibilities regarding systems.
We did have at least 2 different systems in my recollection.
We did.
The initial one was kind of grown on our own, wasn't it?
Yeah. Well, it was purchased from a vendor in collaboration with UNL, and that vendor went out of business. And then we worked together with the various campuses progressively.
Didn't we use a kind of a canned program for a while called, I can't remember, was it Pan Valet or one of these programs that was essentially a database program that allowed you to... I remember when there was a switch over from one to the other and everything had to be redone.
Yeah, the first system was it was just a circulation system.
Yes, okay.
You couldn't access the online catalog. It had none.
And that was pretty much homegrown.
Well, actually, we purchased that from a vendor too, but they got out of the business, and so we were very fortunate in the timing to be able to go with the current vendor of the library system now called Genesis, that a vendor that was just emerging in the academic library market. And what was fortunate there is that we were able to go together both with UNO and UNL together in the purchase and the contracting, and in some cases...
That does make it nice for faculty and students, too, to have that kind of similarity from one... Because I can look up things in one catalog and use the same techniques to look up things in the other catalog if I want to find what's in Lincoln versus what's in...
You're right. You're only 3 keystrokes away from the UNO catalog now to the UNL catalog, the UNMC catalog, the UNK catalog, as well as many others.
Well, we talked a little bit about number of people who work in the library and then technological changes. One thing that most people would think of, I guess, when they talk about the size of the library is the size of the collection. From the time you came here initially, some years ago, to currently, how has the size of the collection changed?
The size is increased from somewhere in the realm of 300,000 volumes to close to 750,000.
Well, that's a big increase, and that underscores what you said a moment ago about space getting filled up.
Yes. The interesting thing about that is how periodicals and serial subscriptions have changed in the mix of that. We now spend twice as much for that category of publication as we do for books. We acquired...
For journals, magazines, things
exactly.
of a professional nature primarily.
You
right?
bet. And the books, we're spending about half of the amount, and that's because of an inflation factor for periodicals and journals.
Yeah. Well, there are many facets to a library director's job, and we're finding that out today.
Actually, some of the most challenging ones are serving the whole campus. I mean, most of the colleges are very focused on their own turf and their own domain. The library is one of several agencies that's got to serve the whole campus. And it's got to serve both the research mission and the teaching mission and the service mission. And it's got to somehow bridge a whole realm of diversity. And that I think is one of both the challenges and the privileges of working in a library.
One thing I think we really should mention before we finish today, and I want to be sure and get it in, so let's do it now. Special collections. Since I've worked with folks in the Afghanistan studies program, I'm familiar with the Arthur Paul collection. Could you tell me something about special collections at UNO?
Special collections was something that we started several years after I came. I'd worked extensively with such a unit at the University of Utah. I thought it contributed an extra dimension in the way of not only of rare books, unique books, but also materials that could supplement certain parts of the academic program. And so we've had certain special collections, fine arts press books that in a sense grew out of Harry Duncan's own collections and of the fine arts press that he founded here and that continues here. We had, and the Afghanistan, the Arthur Paul Afghanistan collection that you mentioned grew out of the linkages established between international studies and the Afghanistan Studies Center that Tom Gutierrez has been instrumental in. And it was not long after I got here that I was approached by the need for more support for that collection that had actually been given to the university by an economist who had served in Afghanistan, Arthur Paul. And so we were fortunate to be able to acquire an Afghan cataloger, Shaista Wahab, who has done a marvelous job of organizing those materials. And that's a very unique collection. It's one of the only ones in the world. I visited others in Switzerland and where the other main one is, and also in London. But it's something that tied in very closely with UNO's Afghanistan program, particularly when that was more active in the 60s and 70s.
And it's a collection that's sought out by scholars throughout the world.
It is. There are people who come from all over the world to consult that, and we've now got a good part of that collection online, so that they can know what they'll find here before they come.
Yeah. Well, there are two other things that I'd like to talk about. We have about 5 minutes or so left here. But I'd like to talk about your activities in the city of Omaha. I know you've been active with the Literacy Council here. And then I'd also like to take a few minutes anyhow to talk about people you've known and worked with on the campus here. So let's start out with your interest in literacy.
As I began to plan for retirement several years ago, I began to think, well, what that's related to libraries but not of libraries could I do that could could capture my passion, if you will. And I started working, thinking about adults who can't read and what a deficit that is. And I began to work with the Literacy Center. It was then called the Omaha Literacy Council. It's now called the Literacy Center for the Midlands. And as I got in a tutoring involvement one-on-one with adults, I began to think, doesn't the computer have a role in this? Isn't the computer a teaching tool as well as a number cruncher and a symbol manipulating tool? Can it become a teacher? And I got the staff at the Literacy Center for the Midlands involved in that idea, and I said, you know, maybe we could get some recycled computers from, I mean, these things are turning over every year, you know, and we were able to get donations from local firms.
Did it work? I mean, did you improve literacy with computer instruction?
I haven't got evidence. You're critical. You're an experimental psychologist, and I can't present you the data that, you know, I can't even present myself the data at the level that I would like to have it, that demonstrates, you know, this is the results of this. But I mean, we've got over 80 computers, recycled computers, in the homes of adult, functionally illiterate folks in Omaha.
It certainly serves a motivational function, and if nothing else,
absolutely.
But probably something else.
Absolutely. It even serves a family function, if you can think of the kids using the computer, and I mean, it serves multiple functions, and yes.
Time's slipping away from us here, so let's shift to the second topic that I wanted to talk about before we left, and that's memorable people.
Yeah.
You started here with Dr. Roskins, I guess, as president?
Actually, it was Del Weber.
Del Weber
had just been here. I think he'd been hired early in January, in '78, and I came in November.
And then Herb Garfinkel was vice chancellor.
Actually,
those are certainly memorable people, at least in my mind.
Right, right. And
do you have any special memories of them?
Actually, the acting vice chancellor was then John Kerrigan when I came.
Yeah.
And then Otto Bauer came a few months later. Okay. The people that I remember with great fondness, both Otto and Del, it was their sense of humor.
Yeah.
You know, they're teasing, they're joshing, they're making fun. They're coming up in tense moments with things that somehow dissipated the concern and the anxiety, and taking everybody down to size, you know, when they get puffed up.
They're telling me now that we need to wrap this up. Okay. So I want to thank you very much for coming in here and spending some time with me today. It's been fun. I've enjoyed it. Our guest today has been Robert Runyon, a retired Dean of Library Services at UN Omaha. And I want to thank you and our audience for joining us today in a visit with Mr. Runyon. We've been taking a look at some of the history of UN Omaha as seen through the eyes of the history makers. This is Jack Newton inviting you to join us again in the series we call Reflections in Time.
Reflections in Time is made possible in part by support from the UNO Alumni Association, fostering a legacy of alumni giving since 1913.